In February of 2020, there was this pale green, heavier than air cloud that descended on a very small town called Satartia, Mississippi.
Right.
It basically rolled through the woods, settled into the valleys, and just crept right across the local roads. And as it hit the town,
Yeah.
people literally started collapsing.
Yeah. It was a terrifying scene.
Residents were found just unconscious, in their cars, on their front lawns. And when first responders rushed in to help, something even more bizarre happened.
The vehicles, right?
Exactly. The combustion engines in their ambulances and fire trucks just suddenly stalled out. They couldn't even drive into the cloud to save people because their trucks were, well, literally suffocating.
Wow.
And this wasn't some kind of chemical weapon or, a nerve gas leak. It was a ruptured pipeline carrying the exact substance we are currently spending billions of dollars trying to pull out of the atmosphere, carbon dioxide.
It's a genuinely chilling scenario.
Yeah.
And I think it shatters this very comforting illusion we have about environmental solutions.
How so?
Well, we tend to view climate action as purely beneficial, right? Almost benign, like, planting trees or putting up solar panels, switching to an electric car.
Right, the feel-good stuff.
Exactly. But when we start talking about the industrial scale capture and transportation of CO2, we are dealing with massive, highly pressurized infrastructure. And that carries real physical dangers.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are wading into the absolute thick of, honestly, the single most hotly contested high-stakes debate in global climate policy. We're talking about carbon capture and storage, or CCS.
It is the big one.
It really is.
Yeah.
Our mission for today's deep dive is to completely unpack this industry for you, because there is a fundamental, almost existential tension here.
Yeah.
Are these technologies a critical, unavoidable tool for reducing global greenhouse gas emissions? Or are they just this dangerous, incredibly expensive distraction that, quietly perpetuates our entire economic dependence on fossil fuels?
And to really answer that, we have to look way past the political buzzwords and the sleek corporate marketing campaigns. We need to examine the actual physics and chemistry of how this machinery works. We have to look at the historical failure rates.
Which are pretty staggering, spoiler alert.
Oh, absolutely staggering. And we have to follow the money. We need to look at the massive, unprecedented government subsidies that are honestly keeping this entire sector afloat.
Because the reality of carbon capture is far, far messier than a simple bullet point on a climate pledge. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Before we can even begin to debate whether CCS is, saving the climate or just saving the fossil fuel industry, we need to know exactly what the physical machinery actually does.
Yeah.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they define CCS broadly as capturing CO2 from a large point source, compressing it, and then isolating it long-term.
But the physical reality of actually doing that is incredibly daunting.
Yeah, we are talking about three main capture technologies, right?
We are, and they each represent a totally different engineering philosophy for tackling the same core chemical problem. So first, you have post-combustion capture. This is the most common one, especially for retrofitting existing power plants. Basically, you burn your fuel, like coal or natural gas, to generate electricity. And then you try to scrub the CO2 out of the chaotic, super hot exhaust gas right before it goes up the smokestack.
So after the fire, basically. Then you have pre-combustion capture, which is wild to me.
Yeah, that one is fascinating.
You actually alter the fuel before you even burn it. It's used heavily in natural gas processing. You partially oxidize the fuel, usually reacting it with steam, to create this mixture of hydrogen and CO2.
Right.
Then you separate the CO2 out and you burn the hydrogen for power.
Exactly. And finally, there's oxy-fuel combustion. So instead of burning fuel in regular air,
Which is mostly nitrogen, right?
air is about 78% nitrogen, which brings all that useless nitrogen into your exhaust stream. Instead of that, you burn the fuel in pure oxygen.
Oh.
So the resulting exhaust is almost entirely just CO2 and water vapor. You literally just condense the water out and you're left with a relatively pure stream of CO2.
Let's focus on that first one, though, post-combustion capture. Because that is the dominant technology being, bolted onto power plants around the world right now.
It is, yeah.
The process relies on these chemicals called amine solvents. And to understand how difficult this is, imagine like a hurricane-force wind tunnel blowing hot, dirty exhaust.
That's a good way to picture it.
You can't just put a physical net across it to catch the carbon.
Yeah.
It's a gas. Instead, you are spraying a continuous chemical mist, this amine solvent, directly into that hurricane.
Right.
You are basically hoping that the amine molecules chemically bond specifically to the invisible carbon dioxide molecules as they fly by at incredibly high speeds, all while ignoring the nitrogen, the oxygen, everything else in the smoke.
Yeah.
Then you have to somehow catch all that liquid at the bottom of the stack. It's like trying to filter out a single dissolved ingredient from a complex soup after it's already been cooked and served.
That's exactly it. And catching the liquid is really only step one. Because once that amine solvent has chemically bonded with the CO2, well, you have a totally new problem.
Right.
You now have millions of gallons of a chemical compound that is holding on to the carbon. You can't just bury the liquid.
No.
You need the CO2 back in a pure gas form so you can compress it. And you desperately need to reuse that expensive amine solvent.
Which brings us to the core thermodynamic flaw of this entire system. To break that chemical bond, to get the CO2 out of the liquid, you have to boil it.
You have to pump that saturated solvent into a regeneration unit and heat it to a very, very high temperature.
And boiling liquid takes energy.
A massive amount of energy. Heating industrial volumes of liquid requires an absolutely tremendous amount of power. In the engineering world, they call this the parasitic load.
Or the energy penalty, right?
Exactly. Right out of the gate, a power plant equipped with carbon capture has to cannibalize a significant portion of the electricity it just generated merely to run its own cleaning equipment.
See, this is a physical reality that completely gets buried in the policy discussions. And you might be wondering, why should you care about the thermodynamics of boiling amine solvents?
Because it dictates everything else.
Exactly. Because that sheer physical difficulty directly dictates the massive financial cost. You are basically fighting entropy. The carbon naturally wants to spread out and disperse.
Right.
Forcing it back into a concentrated form takes immense work. It's the physics driving the economics, which in turn drives the entire political debate we're going to explore today.
And just consider the scale of that energy penalty. We've separated the CO2, right? But now we have to transport it and store it.
Yeah.
You can't just pump a loose gas underground. It takes up way too much volume, so you have to compress it until it becomes a supercritical fluid.
Which is just a bizarre state of matter. I mean, it's not really a gas, but it's not really a liquid either.
It exhibits properties of both. A supercritical fluid has the density of a liquid, meaning you can pack a lot of it into a really small space, but it has the diffusivity of a gas, meaning it can expand to fill the microscopic pores in underground rock formations. But again, compressing a gas to that extreme pressure, which is usually over 1,000 pounds per square inch, requires massive energy-hungry compressor stations.
Okay, so we've paid the massive energy penalty to capture it. We've paid another huge energy penalty to compress it into this supercritical fluid. Where does it go?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. If you are a citizen just reading a climate pledge, the logical assumption is that it goes away, deep underground into a saline aquifer, locked away from the atmosphere forever.
But the data reveals a completely different reality.
Only about 20% of all captured CO2 globally actually goes to dedicated geological storage. 20%.
Which leaves a massive 80%. 4/5 of all the carbon we currently capture globally goes toward a commercial industrial process called enhanced oil recovery, or EOR.
I want to make sure we just sit with this fact for a second, because it feels like a glitch in the matrix when you first hear it.
It really does.
We are spending billions of dollars and burning massive amounts of energy to capture carbon dioxide from fossil fuels.
Right.
Just to hand it over to oil companies so they can pump it underground to extract more carbon-heavy oil.
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of enhanced oil recovery, because they perfectly illustrate why the fossil fuel industry has been the primary driver of this technology for decades.
Yeah, tell us about that.
EOR is not some new climate innovation.
Right.
Oil companies in Texas pioneered it way back in 1972.
Wow, the 70s.
Yeah. When you drill an oil well, natural pressure pushes the easy oil up.
Yeah.
When that pressure drops, you pumped water down to force more out.
Standard drilling.
But eventually, the remaining oil is just too stubborn, it's thick, it's highly viscous, and it clings tightly to the porous rock.
Enter supercritical CO2.
Precisely. If you inject highly pressurized supercritical CO2 down into that depleted reservoir, it acts like a solvent.
Like paint thinner or something.
Exactly. It physically mixes with that stubborn crude oil. It makes the oil less viscous, causing it to swell and flow much more easily.
Ah, I see.
And simultaneously, it repressurizes the entire geological formation. This pushes millions of barrels of previously unrecoverable oil right to the surface.
And the yield is just staggering. depending on the geology of the specific. Pumping that carbon underground yields roughly 2 extra barrels of oil for every single ton of CO2 injected.
It is an incredibly lucrative practice.
It's so lucrative that the industry actually changed the terminology to protect it, didn't they?
They did. For decades, the tech was just called CCS, carbon capture and storage. But around 2013, there was a concerted effort by industry lobbyists to rebrand it to CCUS,
Right.
carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
Utilization being a very polite, PR-friendly word for, using it to pump more crude oil.
By adding that U, the industry effectively reframed a massive waste management expense into a critical revenue stream.
Smart marketing.
They argued that the only way to economically scale up carbon capture was to create a market for the CO2. And the only buyer with pockets deep enough to buy millions of tons of CO2 was the oil extraction industry.
But the climate math here is a total paradox.
Yeah.
Let's look at the scientific split on this.
Yeah.
Because it is fiercely debated in the scientific community.
It really is.
On one side, you have researchers and environmental groups looking at the absolute numbers. If you use a ton of CO2 to extract 2 new barrels of oil, and then you refine and burn those 2 barrels of oil, you are putting significantly more carbon into the atmosphere than you originally captured.
Right.
You are actively increasing overall global emissions. It's taking 1 incredibly expensive step forward and 2 massive steps back.
But then you look at the other side of the debate, and this side is supported by major organizations like the International Energy Agency, the IEA.
Okay, what do they say?
Well, they don't look at absolute emissions in a vacuum. They use complex global economic models. The IEA argues for what is called displacement theory.
Displacement theory.
Yeah. Their model assumes that if you produce a barrel of oil in Texas using EOR, it doesn't actually add to total global oil consumption.
Why not?
Because global demand is somewhat fixed. So that Texas barrel simply displaces a barrel of oil that would have otherwise been drilled in, say, Saudi Arabia or Russia using traditional methods.
The logic being the global economy is going to burn 100 million barrels of oil today, no matter what we do.
Exactly.
So it might as well be this EOR oil, because at least the extraction process shoved a little bit of CO2 underground.
That is the absolute core of the displacement argument. If you assume 100% displacement, EOR looks like a slight net positive for the climate.
Okay.
But if you assume 0% displacement, meaning the new oil just adds to a glut of cheap oil on the market, encouraging more consumption,
Right.
then EOR is a massive net negative.
But wait, let's push that logic further for a second. Even if you accept the absolute best case scenario modeled by the IEA, even if you believe every drop of EOR oil perfectly displaces a drop of traditional oil, you still have to account for the physical extraction process itself.
And that physical process is incredibly dirty.
Right.
When you pump that thinned out oil to the surface, a large percentage of the injected CO2 comes bubbling right back up with it. It doesn't all stay magically trapped on the first try.
So what happens to it?
So the oil company has to capture that gas at the wellhead, separate the CO2 from the oil, recompress it, and shove it back down the hole.
You are recycling gas on a massive industrial loop.
You are running giant fossil fuel-powered compressors around the clock just to maintain that underground pressure.
Wow.
The data shows that even keeping fugitive losses to an absolute minimum, the sheer energy required to run an EOR operation emits about 0.23 tons of new CO2 into the atmosphere for every single ton you actually manage to trap permanently in the rock.
Let me get this straight.
Mm-hmm.
You are generating nearly 1/4 of a ton of new emissions just to run the machines that bury a single ton of carbon.
That's the math says.
And that is before anyone even refines or burns the new oil. It is a very, very long way from the zero emissions future that this technology is constantly associated with in the press.
Which forces us to ask a very pragmatic question.
Okay.
If the oil industry so clearly benefits from the economics of CCS, how well has this machinery actually performed when its only job is saving the climate?
That's a great point.
What happens when you take away the oil revenue and just try to bury the gas?
Let's trace the historical track record on that. As we noted, the tech has been actively used for oil recovery since the 70s. But the very first dedicated climate project, where the sole goal was storing carbon in a saline aquifer to avoid carbon taxes not extracting oil, was the Sleipner gas field project in Norway.
Right, Sleipner.
And that started in 1996. So engineers have had roughly 30 years of modern data and field testing to refine this strictly for climate purposes. But the historical statistics are brutal.
The failure rate is just staggering. Around 70% of all announced CCS projects globally have simply failed to materialize. 70%.
Yes, they get announced with massive press conferences, they secure initial funding, and then they quietly collapse during the feasibility stage.
And if you look specifically at the electricity sector, the idea of retrofitting coal and gas power plants to make them clean coal.
Oh, the power sector failure rate is catastrophic.
Yeah.
Over 98% of projects proposed in the power sector have failed.
98%.
Out of all the hype and all the billions invested over the decades, as of July 2024, there are only 44 commercial CCS plants operating in the entire world.
Just 44.
And collectively, those 44 facilities capture roughly 1,000.1% of global annual greenhouse gas emissions.
A fraction of a fraction of a percent. We need to dive deep into some of these specific high-profile failures because they aren't just bad luck.
No, they're systemic.
Right. They illustrate the fundamental roadblocks of marrying experimental chemistry to global energy markets. Let's look at the Petronova project in Texas. Petronova is a perfect case study. It was a billion-dollar retrofit of the massive WA Parish coal-fired power plant.
$1 billion.
Yeah, and it was heavily subsidized by the U.S. Department of Energy. It was touted as the absolute crown jewel of clean coal technology.
Okay.
It was designed to capture 90% of the emissions from a specific slipstream of the plant's exhaust.
But the reality on the ground was completely different. When independent researchers looked at the data over a 20-year operational time frame, factoring in all the times the capture unit broke down, the times it needed maintenance, and that massive energy penalty required to run it,
the actual capture rate was dismal.
the actual rate of emissions reduction averaged only 10.8%.
Barely 10%. And the reason it ultimately failed highlights the economic fragility of the whole system.
Right.
Petronova didn't have dedicated geological storage. It relied entirely on selling its captured CO2 to a nearby oil field for EOR.
Oh, I see where this is going.
In 2020, when the global pandemic hit, the price of crude oil plummeted. Suddenly, the oil field didn't want to buy the CO2 anymore.
So what happened?
Because it cost way too much to run the capture equipment without that revenue stream, the operators simply turned the billion-dollar climate machine off.
Just turned it off.
They just kept burning coal and venting the exhaust straight into the air.
Because the machine wasn't built to save the climate. It was built to sell gas to oil companies. And the moment the oil market crashed, the climate benefits instantly vanished.
Exactly.
But let's look at a failure where geology, not just economics, was the culprit. The Gorgon Gas Project in Western Australia.
Gorgon is one of the largest natural gas projects on the planet. It's operated by Chevron on Barrow Island.
Okay.
The raw gas they extract there naturally contains a very high concentration of CO2. To sell a natural gas, they have to separate that CO2 out anyway.
That makes sense.
So, as a condition of their environmental approval, they promised the Australian government they would inject that waste CO2 deep beneath the island rather than venting it.
Right.
They spent over $3 billion building the injection infrastructure.
$3 billion. You would think at that price tag the engineering would be foolproof.
You would think. But the subsurface geology did not cooperate. You cannot just endlessly shove pressurized gas into rock formations.
Because it's not an empty cave down there.
Exactly. The rock already has fluids in it, usually ancient saline water. As you pump millions of tons of CO2 down there, the pressure in the reservoir builds up.
Right.
If it builds up too much, you risk fracturing the rock seal, which would let the gas escape back to the surface.
So to manage that pressure, you have to pump water out of the reservoir at the exact same time you are pumping CO2 in.
Exactly. And Chevron's water management system, their pressure management wells, clogged with sand and completely failed.
Oh, wow.
Because they couldn't relieve the subsurface pressure, they couldn't legally or safely inject the gas.
So what did they do?
Well, in 1 year of operation, issues with that subsurface water pressure meant they failed to inject 2/3 of their captured CO2. They captured it perfectly fine, but they physically couldn't store it.
So what did they do with it?
They vented it. Millions of tons of CO2 went straight into the atmosphere.
Unbelievable. And then there's the Chute Creek facility in Wyoming, operated by ExxonMobil.
Right, Chute Creek.
This facility is responsible for a huge chunk of all the carbon ever captured in the United States. But their primary business is, again, selling CO2 for enhanced oil recovery.
EOR strikes again.
Yeah. Over its lifetime, it's estimated that Chute Creek literally vented about half of the CO2 it separated from its gas streams.
Half of it.
If the oil fields didn't need the gas that month, or if pipeline capacity was full, Exxon didn't pay to store it safely in an aquifer. They just opened the valves and let it go.
These three projects, Petronova, Gorgon, and Chute Creek, perfectly illustrate the massive disconnect between theoretical climate models and actual engineering reality.
Yeah, the models versus reality.
The climate models built by policy wonks assume these facilities run at peak 90% efficiency, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for decades.
But the engineers on the ground know that a highly complex, highly customized chemical processing plant bolted onto a coal boiler is going to have constant maintenance issues.
Constant.
Unexpected downtime, economic pressures. Industry representatives quietly admit that real-world capture rates hover closer to 75% on a good day.
If that.
But the models that global governments are relying on to hit the Paris Agreement targets demand near perfection.
And these operational failures aren't just causing us to miss targets on a spreadsheet.
Right, there are physical consequences.
Running these highly complex, thermally inefficient plants actually creates new, compounding physical harms to the environment. This brings us right back to the reality of the energy penalty.
If a power plant needs to cannibalize massive amounts of its own electricity just to heat the amine solvents and compress the gas, it means it is producing far less electricity for the grid. So, to keep the lights on in the city, the plant has to burn significantly more fuel. It's like trying to run a marathon while carrying a heavy backpack full of gear that's supposed to help you run faster. You burn way more calories just carrying the equipment.
That's a great analogy. The baseline engineering studies show the harsh math. To maintain the same electrical output to the grid, a coal plant equipped with CCS needs to burn somewhere between 14% and 40% more coal.
Up to 40% more.
And a natural gas plant needs to burn between 11% and 22% more natural gas.
Think about the massive supply chain required to feed a power plant. If a plant needs 40% more coal just to run its own cleaning equipment, that means 40% more coal has to be physically blasted out of the earth.
That is the concept of upstream impacts. It isn't just about the emissions at the smokestack.
Right.
If you need 40% more coal, you need 40% more massive diesel mining trucks operating around the clock. You need 40% more freight trains hauling that coal across the country.
Shedding coal dust into communities all along the tracks.
Exactly.
And if it's a natural gas plant, needing 20% more fuel means 20% more fracking wells drilled. It means more toxic wastewater pumped into disposal wells.
And crucially, it means significantly more fugitive methane leaking.
Right, from the extraction sites and the pipelines before the gas even reaches the power plant.
Yes.
And methane is a greenhouse gas that is over 80 times more potent than CO2 in the short term. If your carbon capture system requires you to leak vast amounts of methane upstream just to power it, you are entirely defeating the purpose of the technology.
And we haven't even touched on the water uses.
Right.
Thermoelectric power plants already use massive amounts of fresh water for cooling. Adding the chemical processing and compression stages of CCS increases a plant's water consumption by up to 50%.
50% more water.
In areas experiencing severe droughts, putting a massive new strain on local water aquifers just to run a carbon filter is an incredibly tough sell to local communities.
You are basically scaling up the entire destructive, extractive supply chain of fossil fuels just to run the machines at the very end of the line.
Yeah.
But the physical harms aren't just upstream. Let's talk about the infrastructure connecting all of this. The pipelines.
This is a major concern.
This brings us right back to that terrifying story we started with in Satartia, Mississippi. We think of carbon dioxide as an invisible gas that warms the globe over decades. We don't think of it as an acute, immediate poison.
But in high concentrations, it is a deadly asphyxiant. Yeah. When CO2 is compressed into a supercritical fluid for transport, it is packed at incredibly high pressures. If a pipeline ruptures, the sudden drop in pressure causes the fluid to explosively expand back into a gas.
And what happens then?
This expansion absorbs massive amounts of heat, causing the surrounding area to instantly freeze. The gas that escapes is intensely cold, and crucially, it is significantly heavier than normal air.
So it doesn't float away into the clouds like smoke from a fire. It sinks. It pours across the ground like a liquid, filling up trenches, basements, and valleys.
And as it accumulates, it displaces the oxygen. This creates an immediate biological crisis for anyone caught in the cloud, known as respiratory acidosis.
Respiratory acidosis.
Yes, when you inhale high concentrations of CO2, it dissolves in the water of your blood to form carbonic acid.
Oh, wow.
Your blood pH plummets. You aren't just suffocating from a lack of oxygen, your internal chemistry is actually becoming toxic.
At a 5% concentration in the air, you start breathing frantically, your heart races, and you become confused. At 10%, you experience convulsions, fall into a coma, and die.
It's very fast.
At 30%, you lose consciousness in a matter of seconds.
When that mudslide ruptured the pipeline in Satartia, the dense green cloud that settled over the town hospitalized 45 people.
45 people.
200 people had to evacuate their homes in the middle of the night, completely blind in the fog, literally gasping for air.
And as we noted at the start, because internal combustion engines require oxygen to burn gasoline, the rescue vehicles literally stalled out. The first responders had to abandon their trucks and try to drag people out on foot.
It's a scenario straight out of disaster movie. And to make the economics of CCS work on a national scale, the industry is proposing building tens of thousands of miles of new high-pressure CO2 pipelines directly through rural communities, under rivers, and near towns.
That is terrifying. And beyond the pipeline risks, there's the question of the ultimate destination, the storage sites themselves.
This raises an important question about long-term safety.
The IPCC estimates that a well-managed geological storage site will likely retain 99% of its injected CO2 for 1,000 years.
But the word likely in the specific statistical language of the IPCC actually means a 66% and 90% probability.
Yes. And while a 90% probability sounds fairly robust in the short term, we have to think in geological time here.
Right. We are talking about sequestering billions of tons of a pressurized asphyxiating gas beneath the Earth. A mere 1% leak over several centuries, whether triggered by a tiny, unforeseen seismic fault, the slow degradation of concrete well seals, or tectonic shifting.
It could be catastrophic.
Exactly. If it leaks slowly, it undoes the climate benefit we paid trillions for. If it leaks suddenly from a concentrated wellbore, it recreates the disaster in Satartia.
We are essentially burying an invisible, pressurized climate bomb and hoping the geological lid stays tight for a millennium.
Because of these very real physical harms, the threat of pipeline ruptures, the massive increase in upstream coal mining and methane leaks, the drain on local water supplies, the deployment of carbon capture isn't just an engineering puzzle.
No, it's not.
It is a massive, escalating environmental justice issue.
This is perhaps the most human dimension of the entire debate. We have to look at geography. Where are these carbon capture facilities actually being built?
Right, location matters.
In places like the United States, CCS retrofits are predominantly proposed for older, highly polluting industrial facilities, aging coal plants, massive chemical refineries, and natural gas hubs.
And historically, due to decades of redlining and discriminatory zoning, those massive industrial facilities are disproportionately located in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color.
These are populations that have already borne the brunt of severe toxic exposure for generations.
Exactly.
They suffer from statistically higher rates of childhood asthma, cardiovascular disease, and certain cancers because they have been breathing the particulate matter, the sulfur dioxide, and the nitrogen oxide spewing from these plants for 50 years.
So let's look at the dilemma being presented to these communities. Imagine you live a mile away from a massive polluting coal plant.
Okay.
The federal government announces a $1 billion grant to put a carbon capture system on that exact plant. Proponents will say, this is great news. We are making the plant cleaner, and we are preserving local union jobs.
But if you live next to that polluting plant, do you want a technology that makes it slightly cleaner but guarantees it stays in your backyard for another 30 years? Or do you want it shut down entirely?
That's the core tension. The community organizations looking at the engineering data see a completely different reality than the proponents.
What do they see?
They see a technology that captures carbon, which doesn't immediately affect local air quality on the ground, but requires the plant to burn 40% more coal, drastically increasing the local smog, the coal dust, and the toxic ash.
Right.
Furthermore, the amine solvents used to capture the carbon can degrade when exposed to the hot exhaust.
This is a crucial point that rarely makes the headlines.
It really is. When those liquid amines degrade, they can release volatile chemical compounds called nitrosamines into the surrounding air.
Nitrosamines.
Yes, and nitrosamines are highly potent known carcinogens.
So if you are living in that neighborhood, you are being asked to accept a technology that uses up your local water, increases the local mining traffic, potentially releases carcinogens, and critically gives that aging, dirty power plant an economic excuse to stay open for another 30 years.
Exactly. Environmental justice groups view CCS not as a climate solution, but as a literal lifeline for toxic infrastructure.
Right.
They don't want the plant retrofitted. They want it shut down and replaced with clean energy that doesn't poison their air.
The equity issues extend far beyond the smokestacks, too. They follow the pipeline routes. In North America, indigenous communities have been highly organized and vocal in opposing the expansion of CO2 pipeline networks across their territories.
And a major driver of that opposition isn't just the fear of a leak, like in Mississippi. It is the brutal social reality of how massive infrastructure projects are built.
Right. Constructing thousands of miles of high-pressure steel pipelines through remote rural areas requires an army of transient laborers.
Yeah, the man camps.
To house them, infrastructure companies build temporary, isolated settlements. Thousands of workers live in these camps for months at a time, far from their own families and communities.
Historically and tragically, the establishment of these massive transient camps near remote indigenous reservations has been strongly correlated with severe spikes in social harms.
Including violent crime, drug trafficking, and a documented increase in sexual violence and human trafficking targeting indigenous women.
The communities are forced to bear the devastating social cost of building the infrastructure meant to fix the pollution created by the rest of the economy.
When you synthesize the sociological data on how the public actually views this technology, it reveals a massive communication gap. Public awareness of CCS is generally very low. Most people have no idea what it is.
But when people are educated on the mechanics, the pipelines, the energy penalty, the connection to EOR, their support drops significantly.
Yeah, they vastly prefer investments in wind, solar, or battery storage.
The data suggests that if developers engage transparently, acknowledging these risks rather than just dismissing them, projects face less total backlash. But the fundamental tension is unavoidable. Communities feel they are being asked, yet again, to act as a sacrifice zone for heavy industry.
Which forces us to pause and ask the biggest question of this entire deep dive.
Okay, let's hear it.
If this technology requires massive amounts of energy, if it mostly gets used to extract more oil, if the historical failure rate is 70%, if it risks deadly pipeline ruptures, and if it faces fierce, justified pushback from frontline communities.
That's quite a list.
Why on earth does the IPCC, the premier climate science body on the planet, state that it would be 138% more expensive to hit our global climate targets without it?
Right.
Why not just abandon carbon capture entirely and build nothing but solar panels and wind turbines?
Because, simply put, there are certain sectors of the global economy where we literally have no other physical option.
This is the concept of the unavoidable niches, right?
Exactly. It is crucial to distinguish between using CCS to prop up a coal plant, which we have totally viable alternatives for, and using it in heavy industry, where we just don't. Think about cement, steel, and chemical manufacturing.
Cement is the perfect example to illustrate this. Concrete is the second most consumed substance on Earth after water.
It's everywhere.
It is the foundation of modern civilization. To make cement, you have to heat a rock called limestone in a massive kiln. But the heat isn't the main problem. The problem is the chemistry of the rock itself.
Right. Limestone is primarily composed of calcium carbonate.
Okay.
The chemical formula is calcium oxide. When you heat it up, a chemical reaction occurs called calcination. The calcium carbonate breaks apart into calcium oxide, which is the lime you need for cement, and it releases the leftover carbon and oxygen molecules as CO2.
Roughly 2/3 of all the emissions from a cement plant come directly from that unavoidable chemical reaction, not from the fuel burned to heat the kiln.
Okay.
So you could completely electrify a cement plant, power the kilns with 100% pure solar and wind energy, and the factory would still spew millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere just from the rocks breaking down.
You cannot make traditional cement green with solar panels. The only physical way to stop those emissions from hitting the atmosphere is to capture them at the source before they leave the smokestack.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like taking a specialized antibiotic. You don't take it for a common cold, where rest and fluids, or in this case solar and wind, work better.
Right.
But for a specific, stubborn infection, like cement production, it's the only medicine that actually works.
That's a great way to think about it. Natural gas processing is another unavoidable niche. Raw natural gas pulled from the earth isn't pure methane.
It's not?
No, it is often heavily contaminated with naturally occurring CO2. To make the gas pure enough to sell on the market or pump into municipal heating lines, the companies have to strip that CO2 out.
Historically, they just vented that stripped CO2 directly into the air. Capturing it at the processing facility is essentially grabbing low-hanging fruit. The separation is already happening as part of the business model, so capturing and storing it is a logical, necessary step.
And then there is a concept called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage.
Right.
This is where the math gets incredibly complex, but it is a cornerstone of almost every optimistic climate model out there.
The theory behind BECCS is that you grow massive amounts of organic matter, crops, fast-growing trees, or switchgrass.
Right.
As those plants grow, they naturally absorb CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis.
Right.
You harvest that biomass and burn it in a power plant to generate electricity. But instead of letting the carbon go back into the air, you use CCS to capture the exhaust and bury it underground.
If the system works perfectly, it is one of the only technologies capable of achieving negative emissions.
Because you're taking it out of the sky?
Exactly. You are actively pulling historical carbon out of the atmosphere, generating power, and locking the carbon in rock. You are basically running the engine in reverse.
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
But practically, BECCS relies on a massive land footprint. To do this at a scale that actually impacts the global climate, you would need to convert land areas the size of India into monocrop plantations just to burn them.
Yeah, the land use is staggering.
This creates a terrifying competition for land. Are we going to use fertile soil to grow food for 8 billion people? Or are we going to use it to grow wood chips to burn for negative emissions?
Even within these unavoidable niches like cement, steel, BECCS, we have to be realistic about the sheer scale of the engineering.
Right.
The International Energy Agency has actually issued severe warnings about having excessive expectations for carbon capture.
They ran the numbers, didn't they?
They did. The fossil fuel industry often suggests that we don't need to phase out oil and gas, we just need to capture the emissions.
Just filter it all.
Exactly. So the IEA calculated what it would actually cost to deploy CCS and direct air capture extensively enough to abate all of our current global oil and gas consumption.
The price tag they came up with is $3.5 trillion every single year.
To put that in perspective, $3.5 trillion is roughly equivalent to the entire annual revenue of the global oil and gas industry today.
It's economically impossible.
It really is. It is economically impossible to use CCS as a universal band-aid to maintain the status quo. The infrastructure simply costs too much. It is a highly specialized, incredibly expensive tool meant for a few stubborn industrial niches, not a silver bullet to save the internal combustion engine.
And that tension between viewing CCS as a highly specialized antibiotic for cement versus viewing it as a universal miracle cure that lets us keep burning coal indefinitely brings us to the ultimate political battleground.
The massive high-stakes war over a single word.
Abated.
Right, abated.
Yeah.
Now, before we dive into this geopolitical fight, we need to be incredibly clear with you about our role here.
Yes, very important.
We are not taking a political side in this deep dive. We are not endorsing the fossil fuel industry's vision of the future, nor are we endorsing the campaigns of environmental NGOs.
Exactly. Our purpose is to impartially report on the intense, multi-billion-dollar debate captured in the research. Because understanding how these two sides fight over language is the only way to understand how global climate treaties are actually written.
So let's look at the battlefield. On one side, you have the multinational fossil fuel corporations and petrostates.
Right.
They promote carbon capture aggressively, framing it as a triumph of industrial innovation. Their public statements often explicitly state that global energy demand is rising, that fossil fuels will be required for decades, and that CCS is the technological bridge that allows the world to use reliable fossil energy without destroying the climate.
And they back up that vision with massive lobbying power. At the 2023 UN Climate Conference, COP28, independent analyses found that at least 475 lobbyists specifically dedicated to promoting carbon capture were present, deeply involved in the negotiations.
475. On the other side, you have environmental, non-governmental organizations. Groups like Friends of the Earth and the Center for International Environmental Law,
Right.
they hold fiercely negative views on the technology. When surveyed, these NGOs rate fossil energy paired with CCS just as poorly as they rate nuclear weapons or unmitigated coal burning.
Oh, wow.
They view the technology as a dangerous, unproven distraction.
Their core argument is that every hour of engineering talent and every $1 billion of taxpayer money spent on carbon capture pipelines is resources stolen from the deployment of true renewable energy like wind, solar, and grid-scale batteries.
Yeah.
They see the entire industry as a sophisticated Trojan horse designed to guarantee the survival of the fossil fuel business model.
And these two completely incompatible worldviews collided head-on at COP28 over the definition of the word abated.
Right.
During the conference, the nations of the world finally agreed to transition away from fossil fuels and specifically agreed to accelerate the phase-down of unabated coal power.
Unabated coal. But the treaty didn't legally define what abated actually means, did it?
No, it didn't.
If we don't define the word abated, aren't we just building a massive legal loophole for business as usual?
That is the core critique. Without a strict, legally binding definition, a utility company could install a cheap, incredibly inefficient carbon capture system on a 50-year-old coal plant.
Okay.
Maybe that system only captures 20% or 30% of the plant's emissions while using more water and burning more coal to run. But because it has a capture unit bolted to it, the company can legally rebrand that facility as an abated fossil fuel plant.
So they completely avoid the international mandate to phase down.
Exactly. And they might even qualify for green energy financing.
It's greenwashing codified into international law. The IPCC recognized this danger and proposed a much stricter scientific definition. They state that for a fossil fuel process to truly be considered abated, the technological intervention must capture 90% or more of the direct emissions from the power plant. And the operator must prove they have drastically reduced the upstream fugitive methane emissions from the mining and transport of the fuel.
But the fossil fuel lobby fought aggressively to keep that strict 90% threshold out of the final UN agreement.
Wow.
It perfectly highlights how the future of the global climate doesn't just hinge on wind turbines or temperature models. It hinges on the exact definitions of adjectives in legal treaties.
Abatement has become the primary shield used to deflect pressure to transition to renewable energy. If you can argue your fuel is abated, you don't have to turn off the pumps.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most defining puzzle piece of this entire industry: the money.
The money.
We've established that the technology has a 70% historical failure rate. We've seen that it creates massive parasitic energy penalties, poses acute physical risks to communities, and is embroiled in this fierce, gridlocked political controversy.
So how is it surviving? Who is paying the billions of dollars to build these massive failing plants?
The taxpayers are.
Yeah.
Almost all operating carbon capture projects exist today solely because of massive, unprecedented government intervention. They are practically never profitable on their own as a standalone business unless they are selling the CO2 to an oil company for EOR.
Right.
To prop up the industry, governments are using public funds to artificially create a market for buried carbon.
Let's look at the crown jewel of this subsidy system in the United States, the 45Q tax credit.
Yes, 45Q.
This is a massive federal incentive designed to make carbon capture profitable. The government offers corporations up to $85 for every single ton of CO2 they can prove they stored permanently in deep geological formations.
And up to $60 a ton if they use it for enhanced oil recovery.
If you're a massive industrial facility emitting millions of tons of carbon, those tax credits add up to hundreds of millions of dollars a year in free government money.
But the way the federal government monitors this program is absolutely shocking.
It really is.
The Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, does not have teams of geologists actively monitoring subsurface well pressures.
Right.
To claim the tens of millions of dollars in tax credits, the IRS essentially relies on the corporation's own self-reporting. The companies submit paperwork self-certifying that they successfully captured and buried the gas. It's the honor system.
If $900 million went unaccounted for on the honor system, how can we trust that the billions in new subsidies are actually keeping carbon out of the air?
Exactly. And a staggering 2020 investigation by a federal inspector general audited the 45Q program. They found that Out of $1 billion claimed by corporations under this tax credit, nearly 900 million lacked the required documentation proving the geological storage had actually happened.
Let's pause on that number. $900 million of taxpayer money was handed out to corporations who failed to provide transparent, verifiable proof that the carbon was safely secured underground, compliant with Environmental Protection Agency standards.
And yet, despite that incredible lack of oversight and the glaring failure of the honor system, global governments are doubling down. The subsidies are growing exponentially.
The numbers are dizzying. The UK government recently committed to a massive £21.7 billion subsidy spread over 25 years, specifically to prop up CCS and blue hydrogen hubs.
That's huge.
Canada has rolled out a $5.7 billion investment tax credit program. Denmark has pledged up to €5 billion. Governments are pouring tens of billions of public funds into an industry that has fundamentally failed to prove it can reliably scale.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the economic argument for why these subsidies will magically fix the problem ignores a fundamental principle of industrial economics, the learning curve.
Explain the difference between how solar panels get cheaper and how carbon capture plants don't.
It's a concept economists call learning by doing, or Wright's law. Think about a solar panel or a lithium-ion battery. They are modular.
Okay.
You build a massive factory, and you stamp out 10 million identical solar panels on an assembly line. Every time you double the number of panels you produce, your manufacturing process gets vastly more efficient, and the cost of the next panel drops predictably.
That is why the cost of solar energy has plummeted by over 80% in the last decade. It benefits from mass manufacturing.
But a carbon capture plant isn't modular, not at all.
No.
A CCS retrofitted onto an existing power plant is a massive, bespoke, highly customized chemical engineering nightmare. The smokestack of a coal plant in Texas is different from the smokestack of a chemical refinery in Germany.
Right, the exhaust temperature is different, the chemical impurities are different, the local water supply is different, and the subsurface geology for the injection well is entirely unique.
You can't mass produce them on an assembly line. Every single project is essentially a prototype built from scratch. Because they are highly customized per site, the costs are staying stubbornly, permanently high.
Even with subsidies, it costs upwards of $120 per ton of CO2 just to capture the gas at a power plant, let alone transport and store it.
While the cost of wind, solar, and battery storage just keeps dropping year after year, the economic gap between just building a new clean solar farm and trying to bolt a billion-dollar bespoke chemical filter onto an aging, dirty coal plant is actually widening, not closing.
And we should briefly contrast this with other carbon removal technologies. We mentioned direct air capture, or DEC.
Yes.
This is the idea of building giant fans that suck CO2 straight out of the ambient air anywhere on Earth. It doesn't rely on fossil fuel smokestacks. But the concentration of CO2 in the ambient air is so incredibly dilute, about 420 parts per million, that separating it takes vastly more energy than scrubbing a smokestack.
DHE currently costs over $1,000 per ton. It is light years away from being economically viable on a carbon market.
And what about actually using the carbon for something other than pumping oil, like making things out of it?
Utilization in products like injecting CO2 into synthetic concrete or turning it into plastics is technologically fascinating. But it currently accounts for barely 1% of all the carbon captured globally. It is a rounding error. The vast, overwhelming majority of the industry relies entirely on massive state subsidies to build pipelines and injection wells.
This has been an incredibly wild, dense journey today. We started by looking at the sheer, brute force thermodynamics of boiling chemical solvents just to pry invisible molecules out of a hurricane of exhaust gas.
We did.
We waded into the absolute mathematical paradox of enhanced oil recovery, the fact that we capture carbon just to pump millions more barrels of oil out of the ground.
We examined the brutal historical reality of a 70% project failure rate. We looked at the terrifying physics of a heavier-than-air CO2 pipeline rupture stalling out ambulances in Mississippi.
And we explored the deep environmental justice wounds of placing these massive polluting retrofits in marginalized communities.
And we unpacked the multi-billion-dollar high-stakes geopolitical war over the definition of the word abated at the United Nations.
It is a dizzying, overwhelming amount of information. But as we wrap up, there is one final, overarching concept we haven't explicitly named yet. One that ties the chemistry, the economics, and the politics all together.
The concept of moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
It's a term from economics. It means that if you are protected from the consequences of a risk, you are more likely to take that risk. In the context of climate change, the promise of carbon capture creates a massive global moral hazard.
How so?
If society psychologically believes that a magical technological vacuum cleaner will eventually be built at scale to clean up our atmospheric mess, does that blind faith actively destroy our political will to stop making the mess today?
It's the ultimate excuse for inaction.
Yes. Are we banking the safety of future generations on a machine that we already know mathematically and thermodynamically requires far too much energy and far too much money to ever run at a planetary scale?
It brings us right back to that human desire we started with. We desperately want a clean, precise solution. We want the flat tire fixed. We want to believe that we can just bolt a magical chemical filter onto the exhaust pipe of our current fossil-fueled way of life and keep driving exactly as we always have without having to make hard systemic changes. But the diagnostic waters of carbon capture are muddy. The physics are unforgiving, the economics are reliant on massive public subsidies, and the infrastructure is incredibly complicated. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives behind the world's biggest challenges. Look closely at the math, and we'll see you next time.